Hi, I'm Rafael Chacón, and I'm the director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture at the University of Montana. And it's a pleasure to introduce you to an architect by the name of Daphne Bugbee-Jones. Daphne Bugbee-Jones is well known as a Montana personality, particularly in the town of Missoula. She was a naval officer in World War II. She became a celebrated communications officer during the War in the Waves program. She also became a state legislator and a delegate to Montana's Constitutional Convention. So she's well known as a legislator, lobbyist, and environmentalist, and a community organizer, and less well known as an architect. And here you see her circled in this image when she took part in the state's constitutional convention in the early 70s. Daphne Jones was born Daphne Eaches in 1921, and she became a well-known individual in Montana. And some would consider her a grande dame. What most Montanans don't know is that she was also a remarkable architect, a woman who, although she didn't practice as a professional architect, she designed a number of important houses in the Missoula area. And she also had the distinction of being the first female graduate of the Harvard program, the Harvard University's Graduate School of Design in the post-World War II period. Daphne left memoirs telling us about her life, and we understand that from the time she was a little girl, she was always sensitive to architecture. She wasn't originally interested in pursuing a career in architecture, but architecture was a field that was kind of infectious to her ever since she was a child. She says at one point that as a naval child, child of a Navy family, that she traveled quite a bit, and on a trip to France, she remembers going into to visit the Chartres Cathedral, and she says, "I was stunned by the enormity and beauty of this great vertical interior." Daphne noted that at the far end of the central aisle, there was a funeral mass being said for a baby. And she said the tiny white casket, when contrasted with the magnitude of the cathedral, held an eloquence that was so sad and so beautiful. I was numb, so numb that I had to leave. So you can see from this early description, she wrote this when she was 11 years old, that she really was impacted by the power of architecture. And so architecture became a kind of obsession for her. From her childhood drawings, like the one that you see there on the lower right, done in France, to architectural sketches that you see there on the left that she did at the end of her career, architecture became her passion, her avocation more than her vocation, but nevertheless an important part of her life. So I mentioned that Daphne had the distinction of being the first female graduate of Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. And she actually was there at a very, very interesting moment. That is the period after World War II. She was the first female to enter the program, and she describes taking the admission examinations as follows. She says, "I sailed out of the test in absolute heaven. I knew I'd done well, and I knew I'd cracked the pearly gates." But she describes Harvard at that moment as a really unbelievable place because she was indeed the lone female in a sea of young men building up America in that post-war period. She says it was tough and circus-like, but also exhilarating. Make no mistake, architecture at Harvard was tough. We listened, we studied, we worked into the nights. Evaluation of our projects was extensive and critical at every level. Our designs were to produce what worked, what was appropriate, and what was beautiful. Discussions were exhilarating and often philosophical. We were to be the stewards of man's environment, no small order. So Daphne trained with some of the most interesting people at Harvard in that period and some of the best architects in America at the time. For example, in 1942, Edward L. Barnes, the great modernist architect, went through the program. And then in 46, I.M. Pei went through the program. Paul Rudolph in 1947. And she came into the program in 1951, graduating a year later. She was in a generation of architects that transformed America under the tutelage of a number of very important architects. Most notably, the architect Walter Gropius, who had left the German Bauhaus in exile, had come to America and was actually leading the program there at Harvard. It was Gropius, Frank Lloyd Wright, other great European architects like Le Corbusier, and most importantly, the influence of the Bauhaus on American architecture that really formed Daphne's instruction in that period. As I mentioned, she had the distinction of being the first female, and here we see her in this image defending her thesis at Harvard in 1951. Well, two important things about this image. We see her with models and diagrams and photos of the site, but what she was designing was kind of heretical and revolutionary in its own right. She was designing a school for delinquent girls, and she often loved the humor and sort of the paradox of the fact that she was pregnant when she was defending this thesis. But what we see in a project like this is that, in fact, she was doing progressive architecture for a society that was, in fact, very quickly changing in the early 1950s, in that post-war period. She did not have it easy as a female in a field that was primarily a man's discipline, but she did very well in these projects and designing buildings for delinquent girls or young women was, in fact, quite a progressive and revolutionary act in its own right. So in 1957, Daphne Eaches married Henry Bugbee Jr. And Henry Bugbee Jr. was a philosopher at Harvard who eventually moved his family, after marrying Daphne, moved his family to Missoula, Montana. And Bugbee himself has quite a reputation as an environmental philosopher. In fact, one of the fathers of the field of environmental philosophy. And the environment and the protection of the environment was a significant part of their life together in Missoula, Montana. And it also directly influenced Daphne's architecture. She did not practice architecture professionally. In fact, she became a housewife. To speak to her about that was in fact a kind of an act of humility, because she actually said, "I'm nothing more than a housewife." But the reality is that she was very civically involved and civically minded, and particularly in the field of protecting the environment. And here you see, in fact, the house that she designed in 1959 to 60 for herself and her burgeoning family. And this was in that Rattlesnake area, the kind of interface between the urban and the rural, between the forested Rattlesnake drainage and the Missoula Valley, where she built her first home. And here we see the interior of that house, where the influence of the Bauhaus and Walter Gropius is very evident. For one, we see a kind of curtain wall, a glass wall that defined the living room, wide eaves, a flat ceiling on the inside of the house, and a huge expanse allowing us to, in fact, appreciate the out of doors. And this is where Henry Bugbee's environmental philosophy and her architectural language, particularly her embrace of the international style modernism, kind of boxy, cubistic looking space, where those two things came together. And what they did was to, in fact, to use natural materials to place the building in its natural setting, and in fact to embrace the out of doors, so that everywhere you are inside this house, you were in fact aware that you were in a natural setting. So there's a kind of respect between the built space, the human space, the man-made space, if you will, and the out of doors. And this is really what made her a pioneering architect in that early period of the 1950s. All of her houses designed in this period have that intimacy with the natural world and that kind of embrace of natural materials and the out of doors. So what you see in this image is, in fact, a list of some of the houses that she designed in that period of the 1950s all the way through the 1980s. Again, she designed these houses not as a practicing architect, but really as a very well-informed architect who was, as she said, simply a mere housewife. These houses, to quote her, were designed for poor professors. Most of them were, in fact, for friends of the family, colleagues of her husband's at the university, and individuals who, in fact, appreciated this vision of modern architecture in a natural setting. So many of the houses that you see here are, in fact, clustered either in the Rattlesnake Valley or in the Missoula's South Hills. And some of them were designed, in fact, for faculty members at the University of Montana and friends and acquaintances that she met over the years. So this is one of the earliest houses that she designed. This is the entrance to the Brown House. And right off the bat, we see some of that idea of architecture being, in fact, a kind of interface between the human space, the needs of the human being for shelter and comfort and protection from the elements, and the embrace of the elements themselves. So this is a house that was designed in the early 1960s, and it shows us, in fact, this kind of a porch-like structure cantilevered way out from the from the house proper. But what it does is it forms a kind of courtyard with this opening to the sky. So there's in fact a kind of an embrace of the elements. You see that the house was integrated or built right into a hillside where the natural environment is in fact respected. It's welcomed into the house's architecture proper. Here's another one of Daphne Bugbee-Jones's great houses. This is known as the Field Residence, and this is on Elk Ridge Road in the northern part of town, in the hills overlooking the Missoula Valley. This house is, as you can see, is quite dramatic in those kind of pitched roof lines that form almost a kind of saddle. And that saddle, which actually sort of brings together the living part of the house and then the functional garage and workspaces of the house, as you can see, is built on a mountainside overlooking the valley. Much of this house is designed with the idea of embracing the hills, the mountains, the landscape that one sees around us, as well as the materials that are indigenous to this region. So it's primarily wood with a shake roof and towering posts that support the house, much like great tree trunks. But the house is designed as a kind of modernist structure that embraces the views, that takes in the natural environment. Another wonderful house that she designed in 1976 shows us some of those ideas that were important in American architecture in the early 20th century, the use of natural materials. Oftentimes what we see here is in fact evocations of great architects like Frank Lloyd Wright or Walter Gropius, architects who in fact were quite sensitive to the use of materials and also the construction of spaces that were actually accommodating to the human form and the way that we were living in the early 20th century. So for example, here we see a great porosity between the inside of the house and the outside of the house, between the natural elements like the courtyard that you see there on the left and the front door and the interior elements of the house. So as you enter the Kimball residence, designed in 1976, you already have that notion of being sheltered and protected from the elements, and yet you still feel like you are in transition from the out of doors. The door isn't an ostentatious portico with great columns or anything like that that signal that you've arrived in the house. It's more like a kind of Frank Lloyd Wright cave-like entrance to a house where yes, you know you're at the front door because of that wonderful purple color of the door, and yet at the same time, you are really being functionally protected and sheltered as you enter the space. The Kimball residence is really Daphne Bugbee-Jones at her best. Here she has, in fact, not only absorbed all of the traditions of modern architecture with that maxim, that idea that form always follows function, that you don't build things that are extraneous or things that are merely decorative, but you build things that are truly functional. And a house like this one really demonstrates that every element here is indeed doing a job, and at the same time is also quite aesthetically pleasing and quite aesthetically modern. So one of the things that you notice is that there's been a shift from the kind of boxes of that mid 20th century modernist architecture. She in some ways nativized modernism by in fact embracing sort of indigenous architectural forms known well in Montana. The pitched or the gabled roof, the shake, the use of wood. Those are elements that are more familiar to Montanans than they were on the eastern seaboard where she got her start. So in fact, she nativized the modern language to our environment, our climate, the needs of this place, and the forms that are familiar here. This house has these very distinctive rafters that, as you can see, rather than ending at the ends of the gables, actually continue onto the ground where they're in fact encased in these buttresses, these concrete buttresses that support the whole structure. Quite a novel element that she designed here. And we know from conversations in some of her writings about this house that, that this architecture is not merely meant to be functional and modern and progressive, that actually there's symbolism here as well. And again, that's part of this idea of nativizing, bringing modern architecture to the West and to our landscapes. The house was designed for a man by the name of Kimball, who had Native American ancestry. And in fact, she said that these beam ends that end in these concrete blocks were actually symbolic of the teepee poles that we know so well in the West. And this is a view of the interior of the Kimball house. And it shows you the kind of simplicity of the architecture, the simplicity of the lines, the kind of almost sparse quality of the architecture. It's nice that the owners of the house have beautiful modernist furniture that is also of this period and sort of matches the great design that went into designing both furniture and architectural interiors. But really, it's Daphne's architecture with its kind of simple elegance and the kind of the honesty of materials and the honesty of structure. Notice, for example, that the beams are exposed. You can see them actually penetrating the wall through those little slit windows there at the top that are almost like clerestories, allowing light to come into what would otherwise be a kind of dark space in the house. So function clearly leads the aesthetics here. And that's very much one of the modernist tenets that she learned at Harvard and then perfected in designing these houses one at a time in Missoula, Montana. And this is actually her final great house. And this is a house that she designed for herself and for her second husband. This is a house that she designed in 1981, so a few years before her death. And it's a house, again, that is very much a kind of a tour de force in terms of engineering and architectural design. This is the kind of central space of the house looking up into a window, a skylight, that actually, in fact, forms the core of the house. And it's, in fact, this grand hall that covers the living spaces, the living rooms, the dining rooms, and the kitchen, all under one beautiful and very powerful roof. Here we see that house from the exterior. This is, again, the Jones house, which she designed in 1981 for herself and her second husband. At this point in her life, Daphne was really thinking about the needs of older individuals, retired individuals, individuals who really wanted views, but they also wanted and needed privacy, and they also needed, in fact, spaces that were more congenial to somebody. So to someone in her age cohort. So, for example, in this house, most of the house itself is on one level. At this point, she was sort of working out the conveniences that what would make, in fact, a house more functional for older adults. She often talked about sort of the problems with American architecture, and sometimes in quite a humorous way. For example, I'll give you a quotation about some of her frustrations with American architecture in this period of the early 80s. She says, "We live in a fantasy land about how our guests come into our houses. In Montana, guests troop through the garage into the kitchen, open garage doors, their welcome mats. They know the fancy front door is locked and always stays locked. This insane American dilemma seems to have no answer. The only real answer is closing the damn garage door." So as you can see, she was somebody who was really reflecting on some of the problems in American architecture and working them out in the houses that she was designing. And this is the interior, a photograph actually taken in the early 80s. That's Daphne there on the right behind those two candelabra there. And this is the interior of the Jones house. So this was her last great project at home that she lived in. And as you can see, they have this incredible ceiling, which is kind of a feat of engineering, which, by the way, she actually worked with some of her classmates who were engineers to work out the specifics of this very dramatic ceiling and roof line for the house. Her interest in views to the exterior with balconies and embracing the out of doors was still very much a part of this image of her style in this period. But really what she's thinking mostly about is the functionality of the space, the unification of the spaces, how those spaces would actually function for her and her family. And this is one of the last images of Daphne taken. And I think that it's fair to say that she suffered quite a bit as a female in the field. She was quite aware of the fact that as a woman architect, often she would show up at a job site and the contractors had no experience with the concept of a woman as architect. They often mistook her for the little lady of the house, as she would say, and often dismissed her ideas because of that. So it was not an easy field, and it was not an easy place to practice architecture as a woman in the post-World War II period. But I think it was, in fact, her embrace of modernism and her embrace of progressive architecture and her defense of architecture, the built environment, as vital for the quality of our lives, that really made her a remarkable architect, not just a great citizen. So I hope you get a chance to enjoy Daphne Bugbee-Jones. I hope you get to seek out her architecture throughout the Missoula Valley. And I want to invite you to read the article that I wrote about Daphne Bugbee-Jones in Montana, the Magazine of Western History, in summer of 2015. Thanks for your time.